March 1927. The preacher wasn't looking for evil. He was looking for a lost congregation member. But when Reverend Elias Thorne pushed through the laurel thicket into the Harrow family clearing deep in the Appalachian wilderness of eastern Kentucky, the warmth of human presence was broken by a sound that didn't belong. A child crying from beneath the floorboards, 5 families, 23 years of isolation, and a breeding program designed to create what they called the pure mountain line. Children born not from love, but from a theology so twisted that it turned kinship into captivity and faith into horror. Before we descend into that darkness, subscribe to stand with us as we uncover the stories history tried to bury, and comment your city so we know where these truths are reaching across the world. How did entire bloodlines vanish into these mountains? And what happens when belief becomes more dangerous than any wilderness predator? The Harrow, Kedrick, Mullins, Gant, and Pritchard families weren't always monsters. In 1904, they were ordinary mountain families struggling through the poverty that gripped Appalachia after Reconstruction. They lived in a region of eastern Kentucky so remote that census takers often skipped it entirely, a place where hollers had no names and families had no addresses. But by 1927, they had become something else entirely, something that the Kentucky State Police would later describe in sealed documents as a criminal conspiracy of genealogical obsession. What transformed 5 ordinary families into architects of captivity? The answer begins 2 generations earlier, with a man who never committed a crime, but planted the seeds of every atrocity that followed. The patriarch was Elijah Harrow, a circuit preacher who arrived in eastern Kentucky in 1878 with a Bible, a rifle, and an obsession that would poison 3 generations. Elijah believed genuinely, fervently, that the original Appalachian settlers carried divine blood, not metaphorically. He preached that the Scots-Irish who'd first cleared these mountains were descendants of a lost Hebrew tribe, and that their isolation from corrupted lowland society had preserved a genetic purity that God himself had ordained. He kept journals, hundreds of pages filled with genealogical charts, biblical annotations, and calculations attempting to prove that certain family lines, including his own, were destined to produce a generation of prophets. His sermons grew stranger. He began teaching that intermarriage between the pure lines wasn't just acceptable. It was commanded by Scripture. Families who'd lived as neighbors for decades began to see each other differently, not as friends, but as breeding stock. Where did this obsession come from? Elijah had spent 3 years in a Confederate prison camp during the Civil War, sharing a cell with a man who claimed to be a biblical scholar. That man filled Elijah's mind with fringe theology, British Israelism, bloodline purity doctrines, apocalyptic prophecies tied to genealogy. When Elijah returned to the mountains, he didn't return alone. He brought back an ideology that would metastasize over decades. Elijah's son, Caleb Harrow, didn't just believe his father's teachings. After Elijah's death in 1902, Caleb amplified them into something far more dangerous. Where Elijah had preached, Caleb organized. He gathered the heads of 4 other families, men who'd grown up hearing Elijah's sermons, and proposed what he called the Covenant of the Pure Line. The covenant wasn't a religious text. It was a blueprint for selective breeding. Caleb had watched his wife give birth to 3 children who died in infancy, common tragedies in the mountains, but Caleb saw them as divine judgment. He became convinced that his bloodline was being tested and that only through controlled unions with other pure families could the curse be broken. The other families listened. The Kedricks had lost children to disease. The Mullinses had buried 2 sons in mine collapses. The Gants and Pritchards were drowning in poverty. Caleb offered them hope disguised as theology. Their suffering had meaning, and their children could be redeemed. But there was a problem. Not everyone agreed. Between 1908 and 1910, something extraordinary happened. The wives of all 5 family patriarchs died within 18 months of each other. Caleb Harrow's wife, Martha, died in childbirth in June 1908. Silas Kedrick's wife, Anne, drowned in a creek 3 months later. Within the next year, the remaining 3 matriarchs, women who'd known each other since childhood, who'd quilted together and shared recipes and raised each other's children, were gone. Pneumonia, influenza, a fall from a barn loft. The official records list natural causes. But mountain communities whispered. Whispers of women who'd argued with their husbands about the covenant. Women who'd refused to allow their daughters to marry within the circle of families. Women who'd become obstacles to Caleb Harrow's vision. Whether by design or by grim coincidence, their deaths removed the last voices of dissent. The 5 widowers were now free to impose the covenant without resistance. And impose it they did. Why didn't anyone intervene? Because intervention required proximity, and proximity didn't exist. The 5 families lived in a hollow system 20 miles from the nearest town of Hazard, Kentucky. No roads connected them to the outside world. Only footpaths through forests so dense that sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Mail delivery didn't extend to their territory. The nearest sheriff's office was a 2-day journey on horseback through terrain that swallowed deputies whole during winter. In those mountains, what happened in the dark stayed in the dark. The families weren't just geographically isolated, they were culturally insulated by a code older than law. Mind your own kin, and expect others to mind theirs. If a family wanted to arrange marriages among themselves, if daughters vanished into cabins and didn't emerge, if children appeared who resembled their uncles more than their fathers, well, that was family business. And family business was sacred. The isolation that protected these families from interference would protect them for 23 years. Owen Garrett was a dry goods merchant who made quarterly circuits through the Kentucky mountains, selling flour, fabric, tools, and medicine to families too remote for proper stores. In the autumn of 1912, he made his first visit to the Harrow clearing. Caleb Harrow bought heavy chain, the kind used for logging equipment, and several large padlocks. Garrett noted it but thought nothing of it. Mountain families secured everything. Theft by transients was common. On his second visit in early 1913, Garrett noticed something odd. A young woman, maybe 16, stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She wore a dress that hung loose, clearly several sizes too large. When Garrett asked Caleb who she was, Caleb said, "My daughter Sarah. She's shy." But Sarah didn't look shy. She looked trapped. On his third visit in the summer of 1913, Sarah was gone. "Married," Caleb said. "Lives with the Kedricks now." Garrett asked which Kedrick she'd married. Caleb's answer was vague. One of Silas's boys. Later, Garrett would remember that Silas Kedrick only had one son, and that son was 14 years old. By 1915, Garrett's visits had become exercises in mounting unease. On his fourth trip, he heard hammering from inside one of the cabins, constant, rhythmic pounding that continued for hours. When he asked what was being built, Caleb said, "Reinforcing the cellar. Varmint's been getting in." But Garrett had spent 20 years selling supplies to mountain families. He knew the sound of construction. That wasn't reinforcement. That was fortification. On his fifth visit in 1916, Garrett saw something he couldn't explain away. A girl, couldn't have been older than 12, emerged from the Mullins cabin holding an infant. The girl's eyes were hollow, her movements mechanical. When Garrett greeted her, she didn't respond. She just stared through him as if he were a ghost. Later, when Garrett asked about her, Luther Mullins said, "That's my granddaughter. She helps with the babies." But the infant in her arms looked exactly like Luther Mullins himself. Garrett stopped asking questions after that. He continued his route, but he avoided the 5-family hollow whenever possible. Years later, at a tavern in Hazard, he'd confessed to another merchant, "There's families in those mountains that ain't right. Something's happening that I don't got words for." In 1919, the U.S. Postal Service extended rural delivery into parts of eastern Kentucky that had never received regular mail. Postal worker Daniel Kincaid was assigned a route that included the periphery of the 5-family territory. He never reached the families themselves. The terrain was too difficult for his mule. But he did reach a family called the Bishops, who lived 3 miles downstream from the Harrow clearing. The Bishops told Kincaid something disturbing. They hadn't seen anyone from the 5 families in over a year. No one came to trade. No one came to borrow tools. "It's like they locked themselves in," Mrs. Bishop said. "And we don't hear the young ones playing no more. Used to be you'd hear children laughing in the holler. Now, there's just quiet." Kincaid filed a report with his supervisor, noting the isolation and suggesting a welfare check. The request was denied. Manpower was stretched thin, and the families weren't asking for help. In the mountains, if people wanted to be left alone, you left them alone. In the winter of 1921, a fur trapper named Jasper Cole got turned around during a snowstorm and stumbled onto the edge of Harrow land. He was desperate for shelter and approached a cabin he assumed was abandoned. No smoke from the chimney, no movement in the windows. When he knocked, the door opened immediately, as if someone had been waiting. A man stood in the doorway. Jasper later described him as hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept in months. The man didn't invite Jasper inside. Instead, he stepped out, pulled the door shut behind him, and spoke in a whisper. "You need to leave. Right now. Don't come back here. Don't tell anyone where this place is." Jasper left, but as he walked back into the storm, he glanced over his shoulder and saw the man still standing in the doorway, staring at him. And behind the man, through a crack in the door, Jasper saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rows of small faces, children pressed against the interior wall, silent and unmoving. They looked like they was in a cage, Jasper told a friend years later. But the cage wasn't made of bars. It was made of people. By the early 1920s, families in the surrounding region traded stories about the covenant kin, a derogatory term for the 5 families. Rumors circulated. Children born with deformities hidden away in cellars. Young women who entered the hollow and never left. A breeding program designed to purify the blood, whatever that meant. But rumors were all they remained. No one filed a report with law enforcement. No one demanded an investigation. Why? Because in post-Civil War Appalachia, survival depended on silence. Communities that talked to authorities were communities that got burned out by neighbors seeking revenge. The code was simple. What happens in the holler stays in the holler. Even when the horror was obvious, even when the victims were children, the code held. Until one man tried to break it. In February 1927, a Baptist minister named Elias Thorne heard the rumors and decided to investigate. Thorne was assigned to a circuit of rural churches in eastern Kentucky, and one of his congregants, Ada Bishop, had urged him to visit the 5 families. "Reverend," she said, "I think there's children suffering up in that hollow, and I think God's waiting for somebody to do something." Thorne arrived at the Harrow clearing on a cold March morning. Caleb Harrow met him at the edge of the property. The conversation was polite but cold. "We don't need outside ministering, Reverend. We got our own covenant with God." Thorne tried to press further, asking about the children. Caleb's response was blunt. "Our children are raised according to Scripture. If you got a problem with that, take it up with the Almighty." But as Thorne turned to leave, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A child crying from beneath a cabin floor. Thorne stopped walking. He turned back toward the cabin. "Is there someone under that building?" Caleb's face hardened. "You need to leave, Reverend. Right now." Thorne walked toward the cabin anyway, and Caleb stepped in front of him. For a moment, the 2 men stood face to face. Then Thorne said, "If you're hiding suffering under that floor, then you're hiding it from God, and I won't let you do that." Caleb didn't respond. He just stared. Finally, he stepped aside. Thorne entered the cabin and found a trapdoor secured with a heavy padlock. He demanded Caleb open it. Caleb refused. Thorne left immediately, hiking the 20 miles back to Hazard. 2 days later, he walked into the Kentucky State Police office and filed a formal complaint. The police were skeptical. One officer told Thorne, "Reverend, mountain families keep to themselves. That don't make them criminals." Thorne returned to the hollow twice more over the next 2 weeks, each time documenting what he saw. Children who looked malnourished, women who refused to make eye contact, structures with reinforced doors and barred windows. He photographed the compound from a distance using a Brownie camera he'd borrowed, but without a specific victim willing to testify, without physical evidence of a crime, the police couldn't act. Thorne's reports were filed, but not pursued. For weeks, he stewed in frustration, knowing something horrific was happening but unable to prove it. He didn't know that proof was already on its way, running barefoot through the forest, bleeding and desperate. Sarah Harrow was 14 years old in 1911 when her father, Caleb, told her she was being joined to the Kedrick family. Not married, joined. She was moved from her family's cabin to a structure that sat between the Harrow and Kedrick properties. a small building that had once been used for storing grain. Sarah never emerged from that structure as a free person again. She was kept inside for 16 years, during which time she bore 9 children, 5 of whom survived infancy. Court documents recovered in 1928 reveal that Sarah kept a diary hidden beneath a floorboard. In it she wrote, "Papa says I am serving God's plan. I don't know God's plan anymore. I only know the men who come in the dark." The diary entries grew more fragmented over time, descending into single words repeated across pages. Please. Cold. Alone. God where? The final entry, dated February 1927, read, "I have forgotten my own name. They call me Vessel now." Sarah Harrow was rescued in April 1927 when authorities raided the compound. She was 30 years old. She looked 60. She never spoke again. Silas Kedrick had 4 daughters. Their names were Abigail, Constance, Judith, and Mary. In 1914, the eldest Abigail was 17. The youngest Mary was 11. None of them ever left the 5-family territory. According to testimony from survivors, all 4 girls were assigned to different family structures as part of the covenant, not as wives, but as blood bearers. Constance bore her first child at age 15, Judith at 14, Mary at 13. The children they bore were registered on makeshift birth records kept by the families themselves, records that listed fathers as covenant or pure line, never by name. When authorities eventually recovered these records, forensic analysis revealed that many of the children shared genetic markers consistent with incestuous unions. Fathers impregnating daughters, brothers impregnating sisters, uncles impregnating nieces. 3 of the Kedrick daughters were found alive in 1927. Abigail had died in 1920 during childbirth, a death that might have been preventable if she'd received medical care. She was 23 years old. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave behind the Kedrick cabin, alongside the bodies of at least 12 infants who hadn't survived past their first year. Not every child born in the 5-family compound was kept. Male children who didn't meet the covenant standards, those born with physical disabilities, those who showed signs of impurity, dark hair, brown eyes, any deviation from the idealized Scots-Irish phenotype, were removed. But where did they go? In 1927, investigators found evidence of at least 19 male children born between 1912 and 1926 who appeared on family birth records but were never seen again. Some were recorded as died in infancy without burial locations. Others simply vanished from the records after a certain age. When authorities pressed survivors for answers, the responses were chilling. One woman, whose name was withheld from public records, testified, "They took the boys who didn't belong, took them into the woods. We never saw them again." A search of the surrounding forest in the months following the raid uncovered shallow graves containing the remains of children aged between 2 and 10. Forensic examination revealed signs of malnutrition and blunt force trauma. These were the discarded bloodline, children deemed unworthy of the covenant's vision. The 5 families didn't randomly assign women and girls to breeding roles. There was a method, documented in journals kept by Caleb Harrow and Luther Mullins. The selection process was terrifyingly deliberate. Girls were evaluated at age 10 for purity markers: light hair, blue or green eyes, height, bone structure, and what Caleb called spiritual temperament, a euphemism for compliance. Girls who met the criteria were moved into what the families called preparation houses, isolated cabins where they were separated from their mothers and indoctrinated into the covenant's theology. They were taught that their bodies didn't belong to them. They belonged to God's plan. Resistance was met with isolation, starvation, and physical punishment. Why did some families allow this? Because the covenant offered something that poverty couldn't: purpose. In a region devastated by economic collapse where children died from preventable diseases and futures were measured in survival rather than success, Caleb Harrow's theology offered meaning. It promised that suffering had a divine goal, and for families desperate enough to believe, that promise was enough. You might wonder, if girls vanished into the hollow, why didn't their extended families intervene? The answer is grim. Many of the victims were daughters of the 5 families themselves. The Harrow, Kedrick, Mullins, Gant, and Pritchard families were large, multi-generational clans. When a girl disappeared into a preparation house, her own father often authorized it. Her mother had no legal power to object, and her siblings were too young or too indoctrinated to resist. For the few girls taken from outside families, children of tenant farmers, orphans from nearby communities, disappearances were attributed to the usual mountain tragedies: runaways, marriages to distant kin, relocation to cities for work. In an era when record-keeping was sparse and law enforcement stretched impossibly thin, a missing 14-year-old girl wasn't a crisis. It was a statistic. Lydia Gant was born into the five-family compound in 1910. She was the daughter of Hiram Gant, one of the five patriarchs. At age 11, she was moved into a preparation house and told she would serve the covenant by bearing children. Between ages 13 and 17, she gave birth to 4 children. Only one survived infancy, a daughter born in March 1927. But the daughter had dark hair, a trait the covenant considered impure. 3 days after the birth, Caleb Harrow entered Lydia's room, took the infant, and told Lydia, "This one doesn't belong." Lydia never saw the child again. That night, something inside Lydia broke. Not her spirit, her fear. She realized that if she stayed, she would die in that room and no one would remember her name. So she made a choice. She broke a window, squeezed through the frame, and ran, barefoot, bleeding, through 20 miles of forest in the dark. And when she stumbled into a general store in Hazard on April 7, 1927, covered in cuts and exhaustion, she whispered the words that would finally bring the covenant down: "Please don't send me back." Lydia Gant appeared in Hazard on April 7, 1927, at approximately 10 a.m. She walked into Turner's general store, collapsed near the counter, and whispered, "Please don't send me back." The store owner, Margaret Turner, immediately recognized signs of severe trauma. Lydia's wrists bore deep scars consistent with restraints. Her feet were infected from walking barefoot through miles of forest, and her dress was torn and stained with blood. Margaret called Dr. Raymond Fletcher, who arrived within minutes. Fletcher's examination revealed extensive injuries, malnutrition, dehydration, signs of prolonged physical abuse, and evidence of recent childbirth. When Fletcher asked Lydia where the baby was, she began sobbing. "They took her. They said she wasn't pure enough. They said they'd put her with the others." Margaret contacted Captain William Doss at the Kentucky State Police immediately. Lydia was taken to a private residence under police protection while Fletcher documented her injuries. Over the next 3 days, Lydia gave testimony that filled 47 pages of typed transcript. Her account was consistent, detailed, and horrifying. Lydia described the compound's layout in precise detail. 5 main family cabins arranged in a circle with smaller breeding houses positioned between them. Beneath some of the cabins were cellars, reinforced underground rooms where women and girls were kept when they resisted. Lydia named other captives: Sarah Harrow, the Kedrick daughters, at least 9 other girls and women being held against their will. She provided names, ages, physical descriptions. She described the daily routines: when men came and went, when food was delivered, when captives were moved between structures. Her memory was extraordinary, a product of years spent with nothing to do but observe and remember. But the detail that finally secured a warrant was this: Lydia knew where bodies were buried. She drew a map showing locations behind the Mullins and Pritchard cabins where the impure ones were taken. She marked spots where she'd seen men digging at night, where fresh earth appeared after a child vanished. Forensic teams would later confirm her map was accurate to within 10 feet. Captain Doss cross-referenced Lydia's testimony with the reports Reverend Thorne had filed weeks earlier. Everything aligned. The structures Lydia described matched the buildings Thorne had photographed. The names she provided matched families Thorne had identified, and her account of captivity explained the sounds Thorne had heard, the crying from beneath the floorboards. Captain Doss now had what he needed: a credible witness, corroborating evidence, and probable cause for a search warrant. On April 12, 1927, a judge in Hazard issued warrants for the arrest of Caleb Harrow, Silas Kedrick, Luther Mullins, Hiram Gant, and Abel Pritchard on charges of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Doss assembled a team of 12 state police officers, 2 U.S. Marshals, Dr. Fletcher and Reverend Thorne. They planned the raid for April 15th, coordinating the approach to ensure no one could escape. The primary objective was the safety of any captives. Arrests were secondary. Doss made one thing clear. We're going in expecting resistance. These men believe they're following God's law. They're not going to surrender quietly. Doss also contacted the Kentucky National Guard, requesting a medic unit be positioned 5 miles from the compound in case of casualties. He arranged for a temporary shelter in Hazard, where rescued captives could receive immediate care. And he briefed the team on one final grim possibility. Based on Lydia's testimony, they might find bodies, possibly many bodies. Everyone needed to be prepared for what they were about to see. The night before the raid, Reverend Thorne sat with Lydia Gant in the safe house. She asked him a question that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "When you found me, did you think I was already dead?" Thorne told her the truth. "I thought you might be, but I also thought that if there was even a chance someone was still alive in there, I had to try." Lydia nodded. Then she said something that revealed the true cost of her captivity. "I stopped being a person a long time ago, Reverend. I was just a thing they used. But when I ran, I became a person again. Even if I die tomorrow, I got to be a person one more time." At 4 a.m. on April 15th, the team departed Hazard. They carried firearms, medical supplies, and a sense that they were about to uncover something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. At dawn on April 15, 1927, Captain Doss and his team surrounded the 5-family compound. Officers emerged from the tree line simultaneously, approaching the cabins with rifles drawn. Caleb Harrow was the first to emerge, stepping out of his cabin with his hands empty. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "You're trespassing on private land," Caleb said calmly. "You got no right to be here." Doss held up the warrant. "We have every right. You're under arrest for kidnapping and false imprisonment." Caleb smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "You don't understand what we've built here. You're interrupting God's work." Doss ignored him and ordered officers to begin searching the structures. What they found inside defied comprehension. In the first breeding house, they discovered 3 women chained to iron rings bolted into the floor. One woman was Sarah Harrow. She was curled in a fetal position, unresponsive. Dr. Fletcher immediately began emergency treatment. In the Kedrick cabin, they found 2 girls, ages 14 and 16, locked in a cellar beneath the kitchen. The cellar was 5 feet tall, 10 feet wide, lit by a single oil lamp. The girls had been living there for months. When officers opened the door, the girls didn't move. They just stared, as if freedom was a concept they no longer understood. Not all the patriarchs surrendered peacefully. Hiram Gant attempted to flee into the forest but was tackled by officers within 100 yards. Abel Pritchard barricaded himself inside his cabin with a rifle, refusing to come out. After a 30-minute standoff, officers breached the door and found Pritchard standing over a trapdoor in the floor, a pistol in his hand. He was aiming at the trapdoor. "They're not leaving," Pritchard said. "You're not taking them." An officer fired, striking Pritchard in the shoulder. He dropped the gun. When officers opened the trapdoor, they found 4 girls huddled inside, ages ranging from 12 to 19. Pritchard had been holding them hostage. All 4 were alive, though one had been struck by a bullet fragment during the standoff. Dr. Fletcher treated her on site. She survived. Behind the Mullins cabin, investigators found what Lydia Gant had described: a burial ground. Shallow graves marked by nothing but displaced earth. Over the next 3 days, forensic teams exhumed 17 bodies, 15 children and 2 adult women. Some of the children were infants. Others were older, aged between 5 and 12. All showed signs of malnutrition and physical trauma. One grave contained remains that would become a focal point of the trial: a newborn infant with dark hair, buried in March 1927. Forensic analysis matched the infant to Lydia Gant's testimony. This was her daughter, the child taken because she wasn't pure. By the afternoon of April 15th, 23 individuals had been rescued from the compound: 5 adult women, 14 girls, and 4 young boys. All were transported to Hazard for medical evaluation and protective custody. The 5 patriarchs were arrested, shackled, and taken to Perry County Jail. The covenant of the Pure Line was over. Inside Caleb Harrow's cabin, investigators found 12 leather-bound journals spanning 23 years. The journals were meticulous records of the covenant's operations, genealogical charts, breeding schedules, evaluations of children for purity, and theological justifications for every atrocity. One entry from 1915 read, "The Pure Line must be guarded from contamination. Any child born with markers of impurity is a test of our faith. We must remove them as Abraham was commanded to remove Isaac, not with hesitation, but with devotion." Another entry from 1923 detailed a selection process for girls. Evaluated 3 candidates today. 2 accepted into the program. 1 rejected due to temperament unsuitable for breeding. Assigned her to kitchen duties instead. Will monitor for improvement. These journals provided prosecutors with written proof of intent, planning, and execution. They also revealed something chilling. Caleb believed he was creating a new covenant with God, one that would culminate in the birth of a child he called the Pure Prophet, a child born from the most genetically purified union possible. That child, he believed, would lead a new religious movement. The child was never born. The covenant ended before Caleb's vision could be fully realized. Using the journals, investigators identified 27 individual victims by name. Some were girls who'd been held captive for over a decade. Others were children who'd been killed shortly after birth. The journals provided dates, locations, and details that allowed forensic teams to match remains to missing persons reports filed as far back as 1911. For many families, the journals provided closure. Horrific, unbearable closure, but closure nonetheless. Parents who'd spent years wondering what happened to their daughters finally had answers. And those answers were worse than anything they'd imagined. In addition to Caleb's journals, investigators found a document titled The Covenant of the Pure Line, a 6-page manifesto outlining the theological and genetic principles that governed the 5 families. The document was signed by all 5 patriarchs and dated January 1st, 1910. Key excerpts included, "We, the undersigned families, pledge our bloodlines to the preservation of divine purity. We acknowledge that modern society has corrupted the sanctity of lineage, and we commit to restoring that sanctity through controlled unions. Children born outside the parameters of this covenant shall be evaluated for inclusion. Those deemed impure shall be removed from the line, as is commanded by Scripture and necessity. Resistance to this covenant, whether from within our families or without, constitutes rebellion against God's will and shall be met with corrective discipline." The document was presented as evidence during the trial and remains one of the most disturbing primary sources in American criminal history. The trial of the 5 patriarchs began in September 1927 in Perry County, Kentucky. It lasted 6 weeks and drew national attention. Newspapers across the country ran headlines like "Appalachian breeding cult exposed" and 5 men accused of creating bloodline prison. The courtroom was packed every day. Some spectators traveled hundreds of miles to witness the proceedings. The prosecution, led by Kentucky Attorney General Frank Dougherty, presented overwhelming evidence. Testimony from 15 survivors, forensic reports on 17 exhumed bodies, Caleb Harrow's journals, and the covenant document itself. Lydia Gant took the stand and delivered testimony that lasted 3 days. She spoke calmly, methodically, naming names and describing events with precision that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The defense argued that the families were practicing religious freedom and that the deaths were tragic but not criminal. The jury didn't buy it. On October 29, 1927, all 5 patriarchs were convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and involuntary manslaughter. Caleb Harrow received the harshest sentence: life imprisonment without parole. The others received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. All 5 men were transported to the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville, where they would spend the rest of their lives. Caleb Harrow died in prison in 1943 at age 71. He never recanted. In a letter written shortly before his death, he wrote, "The world will one day understand that we were not criminals. We were pioneers of purity." Of the 23 individuals rescued from the compound, 5 were adult women, 14 were girls aged 9 to 17, and 4 were boys under age 6. Medical examinations revealed that nearly all suffered from malnutrition, untreated infections, and psychological trauma consistent with prolonged captivity. The Kentucky Department of Public Welfare established a temporary care facility in Hazard to provide immediate support. Social workers documented each survivor's history, worked to identify relatives, and coordinated long-term placement. The process was slow and painful. Some survivors had no living relatives outside the 5 families. Others had relatives who wanted nothing to do with them, fearing the stigma associated with the case. Sarah Harrow, who'd been held for 16 years, never learned to trust human touch again. She spent the rest of her life in a psychiatric facility in Lexington, Kentucky, where she died in 1954 at age 57. Lydia Gant, whose escape had triggered the raid, was placed with a distant cousin in Lexington. She completed her education, became a nurse, and dedicated her life to caring for trauma survivors. In a rare interview in 1965, she said, "What happened to me was evil, but I refused to let it define me. I survived, and every person I help heal is proof that evil doesn't win." The Kedrick daughters, Constance, Judith, and Mary, were placed in separate foster homes to help them develop individual identities outside the trauma they'd shared. All 3 eventually married and had children of their own, though none ever returned to Eastern Kentucky. 3 of the survivors never left institutional care. Their psychological wounds were too deep. They lived out their lives in state facilities, supported by social services, but never truly free. The 5 families case became a catalyst for reform in Kentucky and across Appalachia. In 1928, the Kentucky legislature passed the Child Welfare and Protection Act, which expanded the state's authority to investigate reports of child abuse and neglect in isolated communities. The act also established mandatory reporting requirements for teachers, doctors, and clergy, professions that might encounter signs of abuse. The case also highlighted the danger of using religious freedom as a shield for criminal activity. Legal scholars argued that while individuals had a right to practice their faith, that right ended when it caused harm to others, especially children. This principle would later influence Supreme Court rulings on religious practice and child welfare. Culturally, the case forced Appalachian communities to confront the limits of the mind-your-own-business code. Local newspapers ran editorials urging residents to report suspicious activity, even when it involved neighbors or kin. Some communities established volunteer watch groups to monitor isolated families. Others worked with law enforcement to improve communication and trust. But change came slowly. Rural isolation remained a reality, and abuse hidden behind closed doors continued. The 5 families case wasn't a definitive solution. It was a wake-up call. And like all wake-up calls, its impact depended on whether people chose to listen. Years after the raid, Reverend Elias Thorne was asked whether he felt he'd done enough. His answer was both honest and heartbreaking. "I heard that cry from beneath the floorboards in March, but there were cries happening for 23 years before that. I wasn't the hero. Lydia Gant was. She's the one who ran. She's the one who spoke. All I did was finally listen." Thorne continued his ministry in eastern Kentucky until his death in 1949. He never spoke publicly about the case again, but those close to him said he carried the weight of it every day, not guilt for what he'd done, but grief for what took so long to do. While Lydia Gant's escape triggered the raid, it was another survivor, Esther Pritchard, whose testimony at trial provided the comprehensive detail that sealed the convictions. Esther had been held in the compound since age 12. Unlike other captives, she'd managed to retain a sense of self by memorizing the names and faces of every girl and child she encountered. When authorities rescued her, Esther provided testimony that filled over 200 pages of court records. She named names. She described structures. She drew maps of the compound from memory, marking locations where bodies were buried. Her testimony corroborated everything Lydia had said and added layers of detail that prosecutors hadn't expected. Years later, in a rare interview, Esther said, "They wanted us to forget who we were. They wanted us to believe we were just vessels. But I remembered. I remembered every girl's name. I remembered every baby who didn't survive. And when the law finally came, I made sure the dead got their names back." Esther left Kentucky after the trial and moved to Ohio under an assumed name. She married, had children of her own, and lived to age 83. She never forgot what happened, but she refused to let it become her entire story. The Five Families case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how ideology, isolation, and desperation can converge to create systemic horror. It demonstrated that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it disguises itself as faith, as tradition, as a quest for purity, and in those disguises, it can flourish for decades before anyone notices. The case also revealed the limits of law enforcement in regions where geography and culture create barriers to intervention. Captain Doss later wrote in his memoirs, "We failed those victims for 23 years, not because we didn't care, but because we didn't know. And the not knowing was a choice to believe that isolation equaled innocence." Modern historians view the case as a precursor to later cult investigations, including Jonestown, the Branch Davidians, and the FLDS compounds. The pattern is consistent: charismatic leaders, isolated communities, doctrines that justify suffering, and victims who are silenced by fear or indoctrination. The Five Families case showed that these dynamics existed long before the term cult entered common usage. Today, the site of the Five Family compound is abandoned. The cabins collapsed decades ago, reclaimed by the forest. The burial ground was exhumed and the remains reinterred in a cemetery in Hazard, marked by a simple stone that reads, "In memory of the children of the Hollow, may they rest in peace, and may we never forget." But forgetting is easy. Remembering requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that horror doesn't only happen in distant places or extreme circumstances. It happens in communities like ours, among people who believe they're doing the right thing, in the name of God and purity and protection. And it continues until someone, a reverend, a survivor, a merchant, a neighbor, decides that silence is no longer acceptable. The Five Families of Appalachia are gone, but the lessons they left behind remain. And the question they force us to ask is this: what are we willing to ignore in the name of tradition? And how many victims will pay the price before we finally intervene?